Peace talks between Ukrainian and Russian negotiators are getting underway in Istanbul, Turkey. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan welcomed the delegations, saying both sides had legitimate concerns. It's the first face-to-face ceasefire discussions in more than 2 weeks. Delegations from Ukraine and Russia previously met 3 times on the border region of Belarus. Talks then shifted online, but achieved little. Meanwhile, it has emerged that 3 participants in March peace talks with Russia, including Russian billionaire Roman Abramovich, suffered poisoning symptoms such as temporary blindness. And let's go now to our correspondent Julia Han in Istanbul, outside the Donbass Palace, where the talks are taking place. What's happening now, Julia?
Well, the talks between the Ukrainian and the Russian delegations are about to start here at the Dolmabahce presidential office in Istanbul. The meeting is closed to the press, and it's not clear whether any public statements will be made throughout the day, statements to the media. The talks are expected to continue tomorrow. What I can tell you, and you already mentioned that, Turkish President Erdogan himself welcomed both delegations. His government is trying to emerge as a key mediator in this conflict, in this crisis. So for him, there is a lot at stake. He really wants to see these talks lead somewhere. And here we're already talking about expectations. According to the Turkish leader, that's something he said last night. And I quote him here, progress has been made. Things are moving into a positive direction. But then again, we know that previous rounds of talks, both online and face-to-face, including the meeting of the 2 countries' foreign ministers here in Turkey earlier this month, have made no progress at all. And according to the Ukrainian side, their most ambitious goal for this week's talks here in Turkey, that's according to the Ukrainian foreign minister, is to achieve a ceasefire, which would of course be urgently needed for civilians inside Ukraine. We heard another senior Ukrainian official say that he doesn't think any breakthrough will be made on the main issues, and the main issues are those concerning Ukraine's long-term political future. That just shows how difficult these talks have been and are likely to be today as well.
And do we have any idea about how high level these diplomats are? Because I guess the higher the level is an indication that the talks are being taken more seriously by both sides. What do we know?
Well, right now we don't have an official list of who's part of each of the country's delegations. There have been some rumors that Ukraine's foreign minister is somehow involved, a presidential advisor to President Putin on the Russian side. But as I said, we don't have any official list. On the Turkish side, we saw Turkish President Erdogan welcoming the delegations. He also said that his foreign minister will be here to assist with anything needed. But right now we assume that the talks will be held just between the Russian and the Ukrainian team.
Okay, Julia Han reporting for us from Istanbul, outside of the presidential palace. Thanks for that. And we have this assessment from DW correspondent Amin Asif.
The first thing that needs to be said is that Russia is already making concessions, it seems. It looks like the original intent of the invasion was to occupy Ukraine, to take over the government in Kyiv, and that clearly is not happening at this point. At least Russia has been frustrated militarily. But what Zelenskyy has said in terms of Ukraine's concessions is that he put in the most clearest terms to date that he's willing to make Ukraine a neutral country. That means not joining NATO, not having nuclear weapons on its territory. He's hinted at that before, but he's never come out and said it. What he did also say was that he'd have to put this question up to the people of Ukraine, to put it up to a referendum. And at this point, just talking to Ukrainians here on the ground, it doesn't seem clear that they would vote for anything that appeared to give Russia concessions. Now, the Donbass is another question. In eastern Ukraine, a lot of people speak Russian. There are pro-Russian people there, living there, and that area has been contested since 2014. So what Zelenskyy said was that we'll make that a separate question. Those negotiations will happen after a ceasefire in the rest of Ukraine is agreed to. And that is a concession in itself, to say that we will put off those negotiations until we can resolve a ceasefire here in the rest of Ukraine.
And I'm joined now by Sinan Ülgen. He's a former Turkish diplomat and director of the Center for Economics and Foreign Policy Studies in Istanbul. Thank you for joining us, Professor. There hasn't been so much progress in any of these multiple rounds of talks. Do you think Turkey will make a difference somehow?
Well, Turkey is trying to make a difference because Turkey is a country which is a NATO member, but has still a good dialogue with both the political leadership in Ukraine and in Russia. So it is trying to act as a facilitator, or the right term would be good offices in diplomatic practice. But Turkey is not a mediator, because in order to be a mediator, you really need to be tasked by Ukraine and Russia at the same time. At this point, Russia does not want any mediation per se, but Turkey is providing the framework for these talks to happen. Already 2 weeks ago, the foreign ministers met in Antalya. And now the diplomatic delegations are meeting in Istanbul. Of course, a lot will hinge on the developments on the ground. And there, obviously, in the past month, the Russian objectives have not been met. Russia has met with increased resistance. So there might indeed be hope going forward in the negotiations, given that Moscow is in the process of downscaling some of its expectations from Ukraine. And
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy is now saying that Ukraine is, in talking of downgrading, expectations, prepared to declare its neutrality and open to a compromise on Donbass. Does that help things?
Yes, it does help things. So there is a degree of overlap, but we don't really have still much of an extensive overlap that would allow for a real process to emerge. Even on the issue of neutrality, what we hear from Zelenskyy is that, yes, Ukraine would be ready to talk about this, but the alternative to NATO membership would be guarantees from the international community. And that in itself is problematic. So which countries are going to provide that sort of guarantees against a future Russian violation of this agreement? This is exactly what happened with the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, where Russia has indeed violated this. And there's no guarantee that we won't end up with a similar scenario in the future. So yes, on the surface, there is some convergence between Moscow and Kyiv, but nonetheless, I don't think that we're at a point where we can confidently say that this will surely lead in the short run to a ceasefire and then ultimately to a political settlement.
And just briefly, if I may, for a final question, there's still a war going on, as we all know. It was supposed to be a lightning war. It now looks like a long and protracted battle. Given the ongoing fighting, how does that play into peace talks? Is Russia, for instance, in a weaker position now? Can we decide who's in a position of strength?
Well, Russia continues to be in a position of strength because of the asymmetry of forces. But compared to the start of this war, Russia's position has certainly been weakened because it has met with a resistance that it didn't expect. Its armed forces have not performed up to the level of expectations, and Russia increasingly thinks that it will actually profit from a ceasefire. But again, the political conditions for ceasefire and an ultimate and eventually a political settlement are not there yet.
Okay, Sinan Ülgen, a former Turkish diplomat and director of the Center for Economics and Foreign Policy Studies in Istanbul, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Ukrainian forces have recaptured a key Kyiv suburb, pushing out Russia from the town of Irpin. But over in the port of Mariupol in southern Ukraine, the situation is very different. Mariupol's mayor says nearly 5,000 people have been killed, including over 200 children. He has warned the city is on the brink of a humanitarian catastrophe. Russia has bombarded Mariupol relentlessly in recent weeks. Those who have been able to flee have described bodies lying in the streets because it's too dangerous to bury them.
A place of calm after the trauma she experienced in a home city. As we were driving, we saw a small Ukrainian flag. We knew no one could hurt us anymore. The horror was behind us, and we were home. Vika and her cat's new home is Zaporizhia, 300 kilometers away from Mariupol. Many harrowing escapes end here, in a parking lot. This supermarket has been turned into a shelter for those who manage to escape. Here they get food and medical help and share their stories. We were hiding in the theater in Mariupol when it was bombed. We were in the basement. We went down there the day before, and that's how we survived. Videos show scenes of total destruction in Mariupol. Nearly 5,000 people have died there, the mayor says. 160,000 civilians are believed to still be trapped in the city. No electricity, no running water, heating or gas. There is no food for children, and the Russian bombardment is relentless. Quickly, let's hide. It's coming from there. We can recognize it now. It goes from there to there. They're tanks. Authorities are hoping for more humanitarian corridors to get all of the remaining civilians out to safety.
And for more on the situation, we're joined from the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv, by DW correspondent Matthias Böllinger. Matthias, with Mariupol officials looking to evacuate all remaining civilians, is that a sign the city is close to falling into Russian hands?
It's definitely a sign that the humanitarian situation in Mariupol is very critical. It has been very bad for weeks, and you can imagine that it's only getting worse, how dire it must be. And all the accounts that we see from Mariupol are really, really harrowing. And that's the main reason, I think, for pledging to get the people out. How long the defense forces inside the city will be able to withstand the Russian assault is, of course, a big question. They have been encircled. They have not been getting supplies. They might have been presumably decimated. I have no information on that. It's not public, and we don't have any reports on that. But it might be a sign. But I would not. I would not make a bet on that.
And what about the situation in the capital, Kyiv, where you are? What's the latest on the ground?
What we've been hearing is that Ukrainian forces have taken back the suburb of Irpin. That would be important. It was one of the most fought about places here in this region. And it's the one of these, among these suburbs in the northwest, it's the one that's closest to the city. So that would be an important gain. Of course, all of this is to be confirmed, and the situation may still be volatile. Fighting is going on. We can hear that from the city center. Otherwise, the city has been spared shelling or attacks in the past few days, although explosions were heard. This is how most streets in Kyiv look like these days. Before the war, Kyiv was one of Europe's party destinations. This street was full of young people spending the evenings, and not far from here you would hear the constant drum of the bass from techno clubs. Now the only drum you hear is from artillery from the outskirts. Saving statues from war. The fighting has left its mark on the city, even though downtown Kyiv has so far been spared heavy shelling. It's mostly the elderly who are still in the capital.
I was born here. My mother was born here, and my grandmother. My great-grandmother lived here. I was here yesterday, and I'm here today. I am out and about. I have memories of every corner here, and I pray to God that I and all other residents of Kyiv will be all right. We have everything. There is heating, there's water, there's electricity. It would be a sin to complain. Of course, there are restrictions. The very fact that there is a war is terrible psychologically. But physically, we are managing.
According to official estimates, half of the population has left. On the ground, it feels like more than that. Those that remain have been anxiously following the fighting. So far, the outer defenses have held. On Kyiv's central Maidan Square, things are calm. For weeks, Kyiv has been fortified. People have prepared themselves for a possible Russian assault. But as the Russians are stalled in front of the city, confidence is returning to the capital. People are slowly returning to the streets. They're feeling more comfortable being outside. Businesses are now reopening. Some never closed their doors, like this coffee shop in the trendy Podil neighborhood. On the very first day of the war, the owner decided he had to stay. At 8 a.m., people came in and asked whether they could get a coffee. Usually we open at 12, but they looked at me in a way that I couldn't say no. Then even more people came, and that's when I understood many are leaving, but there are those who want to stay, and they need something to look forward to. Since then, the cafe has remained open. The staff have been donating meals to those in shelters and to the military. In a city where so many civilians have left, those in uniform are now among the most regular clients.
And Matthias, talks between Russia and Ukraine are taking place in Turkey today. The people that you're talking to, ordinary Ukrainians, do they still have any hope for a solution to this conflict?
We correspondents on the ground get asked this question every time that such talks are taking place, and the answer is always no. For most people here, it seems unlikely that a country that just invaded your country with full force would offer any meaningful compromise. These negotiations are, of course, important because they can solve day-to-day issues like the humanitarian corridors that have worked with mixed success, but something has been established, and they may be also important for both sides to feel the mood of the other side. But the guess here is that any result, any shape of an agreement will be decided on the battlefield, and it will reflect the situation on the battlefield. And it doesn't look like there is any decision yet, and there is no desire by most Ukrainians to freeze the conflict in the state. It is now, with all these Russian troops inside the country, what the Ukrainian side has said, and that's backed by the population, is that the Russian troops would need to leave first, at least back to the places where they have been before February 24th. That means back into the separatist republics and onto Crimea.
Okay, DW correspondent Matthias Böllinger reporting for us from Kyiv. And now to some of the other stories we're following for you this hour. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has once again pleaded for the West to provide fighter jets and tanks to help defend his country from Russian attacks. Zelenskyy accused Western countries of cowardice and warned that Russia's aggression would not stop in Ukraine, predicting that Russia would move against the Baltic states and Poland. Amnesty International has accused Russia of committing war crimes in Ukraine, likening the situation to its actions in the Syrian war. The human rights organization denounced Russia's deliberate attacks on civilian infrastructure in the country. Amnesty also accused Moscow of turning humanitarian corridors into death traps. G7 energy ministers have rejected demands by Russian President Vladimir Putin to pay for Russian gas with rubles. German Economy and Climate Protection Minister Robert Habeck said that the demand is unacceptable and called on companies not to comply with it. EU interior ministers have been meeting in Brussels to address the arrival of millions of refugees from Ukraine. They discussed a range of issues, such as the distribution of refugees across member states, as well as financial support. Poland alone has already taken in more than 2 million people. Over 300,000 refugees have made their way to Germany. We met one family that fled to Berlin. The husband's Tunisian nationality meant he could make the journey, in contrast to most Ukrainian men of conscription age who aren't allowed to leave the country.
We're in shock, like all Ukrainians who fled the war. We're afraid. We heard the sounds of the sirens and the bombs.
For 2 days, I couldn't believe I was in Berlin. I couldn't understand what was happening. I was in a state of shock.
On the day the war broke out, everyone ran down into their cellars.
When I hear helicopters, I think the war's come here. It stays with you, you know? An aircraft isn't what it was when you were a child, where you'd look up and think, wow, neat. Now, when you hear an aircraft, you think, we're at war. An aircraft is bad.
Everyone in Ukraine knows they could die at any moment. There's not a moment's rest or peace. I slept with all my clothes on. You hear the sirens, the planes approaching.
Whatever happens, I think the Russians will get their comeuppance for the deaths of the innocent children and people in Ukraine.
History won't forget this. People will remember how Russia behaved and what they've done.
For a moment, there was a lull, and we were able to escape. The train station was a nightmare. To be quite honest, I don't even think about the future. I think about my grandmother who stayed in Ukraine, and I think about what's going to happen next in our country. I want the war to stop right now.
Now we're trying, God willing, to forget our lives over there a bit. We hope we can be open enough to accept this new life.
Many Western companies have joined their governments in sanctioning Russia. German car maker Volkswagen is one of them. It's closed both of its production sites in the country, including its plant in Kaluga, which employs 4,000 people. We take a look at the effect sanctions are having on the lives of people there, and many of whom know little about their country's military operation in Ukraine.
Operations are at a standstill at Volkswagen's plant in Kaluga, a 3-hour drive from Moscow. Like many Western companies, VW has temporarily halted production in Russia, but there's no trace of panic among employees. Kaluga 2 is the name of the suburb. It's home to Dmitry Surusov and his wife. He started at VW as a welder. Now he's in quality control. The production stop has left him unfazed.
It's like a vacation. We're still getting paid, even though production has stopped. So everything is fine. It's a chance to relax, and soon we'll get back to work.
Food prices have gone up a bit, but it hasn't affected us much. We'll probably feel it more later. We've been through so much in Russia. A financial crisis, other crises. Nothing can scare us anymore.
Crimea, Volgograd, St. Petersburg. The couple likes to travel, though they've never been abroad. Dmitry renovates apartments as a side job to earn extra cash. He and his wife enjoy fishing videos on YouTube. They never watch the news.
You need to know what's happening in your own life, not what's going on in the world. You can find out about world events from neighbors or people at the supermarket.
In Kaluga, a lot of jobs are generated by the car industry. Aside from Volkswagen, the Volvo truck plant has also suspended production. McDonald's is closed. And Mercedes has stopped exports too. Will the country revert to cars made in Russia?
The problems are enormous, but our rulers insist that we can manage. Unfortunately, the public so far believes them. It's easier to convince ordinary people. They hide from the problems, and there's nothing at the moment that can be done about it.
Like many Russians, Dmitry and his wife only have a vague idea about their army's so-called special military operation in Ukraine.
It's only when the going gets rough for you that politics matters. As long as everything's all right, why should you be bothered?
This resort is a popular place to escape reality. A steam bath and then a dip in ice-cold water. For some Russians, a welcome distraction from the problems they sense are looming on the horizon.